White House lashes out at NBC News over how they edited this interview.
You said that negotiating with Iran is pointless, and then you went further. You said that it was appeasement. Were you referring to Senator Barack Obama? He certainly thought you were.
You know, my policies haven't changed, but evidently the political calendar has.
Negotiations with Iran. Is that appeasement? Is that like appeasing Adolf Hitler?
My position, Richard, all along has been that if the Iranians verifiably suspend their enrichment, which would be a key measure to stop them from gaining the know-how to build a weapon, then they can come to the table, and the United States will be at the table.
Now, in a memo to NBC News President Steve Kappas today, the White House says, quote, this deceitful editing to further a media-manufactured storyline is utterly misleading and irresponsible. I'm sure you don't want people to conclude that there's really no distinction between the news as reported on NBC and the opinion as reported on MSNBC, despite the increasing blurring of those lines, close quote. Now, as you know, there's been a lot of criticism of NBC made by Bill that the news agency has gone far left, and this is just another piece of that evidence. As The Factor reported just a few months ago, Richard Engel, who conducted that Bush interview, has refused to give the surge in Iraq any credit whatsoever. And joining us now from California to react to both of these stories is Fox News political analyst Karl Rove. Karl, great to see you.
Great to see you, Laura.
Karl, this is pretty strong language from Ed Gillespie to NBC, and I saw that Engel interview on the Today Show this morning, and I kind of scratched my chin for a second and say, that's interesting that President Bush would have agreed with the way Richard Engel described President Bush's view on negotiating or discussing anything with Iran. Clearly, this interview was edited.
Yeah, well, clearly. In fact, I've got here the words of the president. What they cut out is the next sentence. People need to read the speech. You didn't get it right either, he says to Engel. The president says, what I said was we need to take the words of people seriously, and goes on to state our position that if you negotiate, you've got to take the words of the leader of Iran seriously. He wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. You got to take that seriously. And this was either a very sloppy job of editing, or it was an example of bias. Either one of those doesn't speak well of NBC News. I mean, they deliberately edited out the president correcting Engel's depiction of what his speech was about. They deliberately left that on the cutting floor, and pretty remarkable.
Now, Karl, why would the White House agree to do an interview with Richard Engel? I mean, this is a guy who, really didn't want to give the surge any credit. And NBC, an organization, obviously, that's called this a civil war, and now it's kind of not gone back and changed its view on that. We're in a recession, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, why bother, really, at this point?
Well, incidentally, you saw in the letter that Ed Gillespie sent to President Kappas of NBC, he reiterated, brought back up the issue of civil war, where they unilaterally decided in 2006 that they would depict this as a civil war. Ed pointed out they hadn't been depicting it as a civil war since late last year, and he inquired as to whether or not they changed their policy. Look, NBC has got a real problem because we're now in a position where we are starting to see the journalistic standards of MSNBC, which are really no standards at all, creep into NBC, which is a respected news organization. Now, you ask, why would the president give an interview to him? Well, look, the president gives interviews to the major news networks all the time. If he were to sort of blacklist NBC would be screaming in the streets and be talking about it every night at news, every night on the news report. So it's important for him to give him the courtesy of responding to a request for an interview.
Yeah.
But you know what? This is an example how they abuse those requests. I mean, this is atrocious. This is really, Richard Engel was a respected journalist. For him to have edited this or allowed it to be edited by some minion at NBC so that the entire purpose of the president's answer is lost and left on the cutting floor is pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, Karl, this follows on, on primary nights, big nights when you're with Britt and everybody here. Over at NBC, they have a couple of their, commentator types, Matthews and the like, sitting next to Tom Brokaw and Brian Williams. I mean, there is no line between news and commentary. It's all blurred, and it's always blurred against the administration, against the favor of the surge, against what progress is made in Iraq. No credit given, and this has been a consistent problem all along. And I just think, what's the point of continuing to give interviews to news organizations that seem like they're wedded to the next presidency of Barack Obama?
Well, again, I think the president did a wise thing by giving him the interview. They did a bad thing by editing the way. Let's see how this all plays out. But NBC owes the American people an apology for deliberately misleading them as to the nature and the content of the president's response to their question.